Okay, great. So today's speaker is Priya Donti, who is the co-founder and executive director of Climate Change AI, a nonprofit initiative to catalyze impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning. She's also running the Cornell Tech Runway Startup Postdoc program right now. She did her PhD from Carnegie Mellon recently, and she's going to join MIT PECS as an assistant professor next fall. Her research focuses on machine learning for forecasting, optimization, and control in high renewables power grids. And she's won a number of awards, and including a recipient of the MIT Technology Review's 35 Innovators Under 35 Award and the Siebel Scholarship. So I've actually had the opportunity to review one of her papers, which was fascinating. I won't tell her which one. I think we are in for a treat. So with no further ado, Priya, it's all yours. Go for it.
All right, Keshav, thanks for the kind intro. And yeah, nice to see everybody virtually. So today I want to talk about some of my work on optimization in the loop machine learning for energy and climate problems. So I likely don't need to motivate this for this particular audience, but climate change is one of the most pressing issues that we as a society are facing today. And we're already seeing its effects, from storms to droughts to fires to flooding. These impacts are being felt globally, and they are disproportionately being felt by the world's most disadvantaged populations, which creates a huge imperative to act quickly on this issue. In particular, according to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we as a society need to hit net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in order to stave off some of the worst impacts of climate change. And this is going to require a rapid transformation across virtually every sector of society, across energy, transport, buildings, agriculture, and so forth. In parallel, over the last decade, we've seen huge advances in artificial intelligence. I mean, AI, of course, ubiquitously powers the digital voice assistants in our smartphones. It's achieved superhuman performance in complex online games like Dota 2. It enables us to classify supernova in astronomical data at large scale, and it's achieved breakthroughs in biology, such as addressing the 50-year-old protein folding problem. So given these large advances in AI and machine learning across many different areas, and given this huge imperative to act quickly on climate change, one might ask the question, are there ways in which AI and machine learning can contribute to addressing climate change? And 3 years ago, a group of co-authors and I set out to actually investigate this question, or are there ways in which AI and machine learning can play a role here? And over a period of 6 months, interviewing and drawing upon our own work and experience and interviewing many different stakeholders across this area, we identified in a succinct 100 pages or so different ways in which AI and machine learning can contribute. So ranging across areas like speeding up power system optimization, to helping us control heating and cooling systems in buildings more efficiently, or even doing things like predicting the carbon content in soil in order to help us better keep that carbon captured in soil. So through writing this paper and through my own work with entities in the electric power sector, we really did see a lot of potential for machine learning tools to play a role here. But despite this potential, there are many limitations that machine learning methods today suffer from that often preclude their actual deployment in many of these key settings. In particular, many climate and energy problems involve some notion of physics or hard constraints or decision-making processes. So for example, let's talk about electric power systems, which is the sector that I predominantly work in. So when I talk about the electric power sector or electric power systems, I'm talking about the system through which our electricity is produced and then transmitted along lines and electrical equipment, and then eventually consumed by end-use consumers like us. So for context, electric power systems contribute about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and reducing these emissions is going to require integrating low carbon energies such as nuclear, solar, and wind into the system. This can be really challenging since these systems are governed by various physical equations. For example, when I put power into the system, it's going to flow along the lines according to the physics of the system. And it's also subject to many hard constraints. For instance, if I want to change the amount that a particular power generator is producing, the amount of power that a power generator is producing, I can only change that by a certain amount from one moment to the next because of equipment constraints associated with the power generator. And similarly, there are various kinds of stability constraints that we need to enforce to make sure that our systems stay near some kind of electrical equilibrium. And failing to satisfy these constraints can lead to, at worst, multi-day blackouts and an associated loss of lives. So we really need to make sure that we're satisfying these constraints. On top of these constraints, there are also lots of decision-making procedures that come into play when trying to figure out how to actually manage this system. So for example, a power system operator might ask, given some uncertain estimate of electricity demand, how do I schedule electricity supply also subject to all of these constraints? So that sounds a bit like an optimization problem, right? And while traditionally optimization and control methods are used to manage this system, what we're starting to see is that as we start to integrate more and more renewable energy, we need to manage this system at increasing scale because we're integrating many more devices. And we also need to manage it much more quickly to deal with the fact that the amount of solar and wind power that we're getting, for example, is varying from moment to moment. And these traditional optimization and control methods are too slow or just otherwise failing to deal with the speed and scale that these new energy sources introduce. And so this has led to a call for new methods. And part of that has led to an investigation of, is machine learning potentially a good candidate to provide the dynamic and data-driven methods that can cope with this speed and scale? But the challenge is that while machine learning can potentially provide some benefits that allow us to cope with this transition to renewables, they do struggle to cope with these physics, hard constraints, and decision-making procedures that I just talked about on the previous slide. So for example, machine learning has been proposed to help us adaptively control different devices on the power grid, so different power generators, inverters, and batteries in order to help integrate renewables into the grid. And machine learning is good at providing dynamic and data-driven control that allows us to do this. But what it's bad at is enforcing this specific physics constraints, equipment constraints, and stability constraints that I just talked about. Another place that machine learning has been proposed and is in fact often used is for forecasting. So for example, to predict the electricity demand on the system. And machine learning is widely used for time series forecasting problems. So at first glance, this seems reasonable. But a limitation is that these machine learning methods for forecasting are often not trained in a way that is cognizant of the broader context in which that forecast is used. And that means that sometimes these forecasting methods can make mistakes that are particularly critically bad from the process, from the perspective of the decision maker who's going to be using that forecast. And I'll dive into an example of more so of what I mean by that later on in the talk. But the high level takeaway is that we have machine learning potentially providing some benefits compared to previous traditional optimization and control methods that were used on the power grid. But at the same time, these new machine learning methods do have severe limitations that the previous methods were well dealing with. And so how do we reap the benefits of these new machine learning methods while mitigating some of these limitations? And so my work focuses on addressing exactly this challenge by trying to bring together tools for machine learning with those tools from fields like optimization and control into kind of a unified framework. So specifically, I do this through the creation of a framework that I call optimization in the loop machine learning, which is a framework for developing ML methods that incorporate knowledge of the physics or hard constraints or downstream decision-making processes through the use of optimization problems. So for those who are familiar with the literature on optimizing machine learning models, so things like gradient descent in deep learning, that's actually not what I'm talking about here. I'm sort of talking about a different combination of optimization and machine learning. What I mean by optimization in the loop machine learning is that we can formulate an optimization problem that captures the physics or hard constraints or decision-making procedures that we want to enforce in a particular domain. And then we can actually embed those optimization problems into, for example, our machine learning model or within the objective function that the model is using to learn. So that's a bit of a kind of abstract notion. So I want to make this a little bit more concrete through two examples, which are exactly the examples I'll dive into during the rest of the talk. So in doing that, I'm going to use this visual notation for a machine learning model, where X are the inputs to the model, H is the functional form of the model, theta are the model parameters that we can adjust, and then H sub theta of X are the outputs of the model. So earlier I gave two examples of ways that machine learning has been proposed for use in electric power grids. So one of them is adaptive control of different components on the power grid. And so in a kind of machine learning reinforcement learning style setting, this might be a setting where you are taking in some information about the state of your system, and the model is outputting the control action that should be taken by the devices that it's controlling. The limitation I mentioned earlier is that machine learning methods that are doing this usually aren't cognizant of the hard constraints they need to satisfy. So maybe one hope might be if we can capture these robustness constraints within an optimization problem and actually embed that information into our machine learning model, maybe we can get a model that is like a normal reinforcement learning method, learning from data, learning to do something dynamic, but internally has some enforcement of the physical constraints that we need to satisfy. So that's one example of how this kind of optimization in the loop machine learning framework might play out. Another example is that I brought up earlier is demand prediction. So a machine learning model that is predicting electricity demand on the power grid. So this might be kind of a more of a supervised learning kind of setup where our model is taking in some historical data and it's outputting some kind of demand prediction. What's important to note is that the prediction doesn't then, live in a vacuum. It is used by, for example, a power system operator to make some kind of decision downstream. And if we can characterize the relationship between the prediction and the decision as an optimization problem and understand how good the decision was that the system operator made on the basis of our forecast, one hope might be that maybe we can feed back some of that information into the training procedure of our model so that our model can adjust and avoid making mistakes that are particularly bad for the decision maker. So this is another place where we might somehow try to embed optimization problems that capture our decision-making process in this case within this broader machine learning framework. So this is me kind of really motivating this at a high level, but in the rest of this talk, I want to dive into kind of specific examples describing, how this actually works in practice. And so in the rest of the talk, having now kind of motivated this framework of optimization in the loop machine learning, I first want to talk about, in practice, what does it actually mean to embed an optimization problem into a deep learning workflow? And then I want to dive a little more deeply into the two examples that I talked about on the previous slide. But before I move on, does anybody have any quick clarifications or anything that they'd like to ask about? Okay, I'll move on in that case. So yeah, so diving into this toolkit first of differentiable optimization. So the motivation here is that while I've given this big picture about embedding optimization problems into machine learning models, it's really easy for me to draw a box within another box on a slide. But what I really need to tell you is how do we actually do this in practice? And so the approach that I take in my work is through this framework called differentiable optimization in deep learning. And so in this part of the talk, I'll dive into this general framework and also briefly talk about some additional tools that exist to kind of embed different kinds of optimization problems into deep learning workflows. So we're doing this in the context of deep learning. So bringing back this visual representation of a machine learning model from before, where we have inputs X, functional form of the model H, model parameters theta, and then outputs. And then we also in our setup, of course, often have some kind of loss function, which is a score for the quality of the output in the model. So when we talk about deep learning, what we're basically saying is that this machine learning model is a neural network, which is a bunch of nonlinear functions with adjustable parameters that are composed together. And each of these functions is a layer. The way the parameters of the model are updated is by using backpropagation and gradient descent, basically understanding what is the gradient of our loss function with respect to each of the parameters, and then using that information to actually update our guesses for the parameters. So this is not presumably new information for most of the people in the crowd, but what I want to the reason I say this is because to underscore the fact that if you're going to embed something into your deep learning workflow, then every single component of this workflow, so every single layer and the loss function, have to be differentiable. You need to be able to take derivatives through it. And so if I'm telling you that I'm embedding an optimization problem into a neural network, then I need to be able to tell you how to actually get derivatives through it to make it work well with this overall workflow of training a neural network. And so the key insight here is that we apply something called the implicit function theorem to the optimality conditions of our optimization problems. And doing this allows us to get the gradients that we actually need in order to embed the optimization problems into our deep learning models. So to dive into that in a bit more depth, you can imagine we have an optimization problem like this. And so the details of this particular optimization problem aren't super important, but the things to see is that this optimization problem has an output z, which is the decision variable of the optimization problem. And it has some parameters phi that are serving as the kind of inputs in a way to the optimization problem. For this particular optimization problem, and it's not immediately evident from the slide, but in the particular paper that this is from, this particular optimization problem ends up being convex. And so we can write down what are called its KKT optimality conditions, which in this case are necessary and sufficient to describe all optimal solutions of the problem. So we basically have some kind of set of equations, and in this case, it ends up being a linear set of equations that can actually describe what our optimal solutions look like. So then having solved, if we've solved the optimization problem and given these KKT optimality conditions, we're allowed to apply something called, when the KKT optimality conditions are satisfied, which is when we have a solution, we're allowed to apply something called the implicit function theorem to these conditions when we're taking derivatives, which at a high level means you can take derivatives of your outputs with respect to your inputs, kind of the way that you would naturally expect that you can. And this allows you to basically write down this really ugly equation on this slide, where this middle term are the gradients that you're actually trying to solve for of your optimization problems, outputs, and dual variables with respect to its parameters. The left matrix here is the generalized Jacobian of the KKT conditions, and the right side are the gradients of the problem parameters. So basically, we've now written down this equation that allows us to figure out what are the gradients of the output of this optimization problem with respect to its inputs. And for those of you who are really familiar with backpropagation, you'll tell me, hey, well, the gradients I want are not actually the gradients of the outputs with respect to the inputs. I want the gradient of the loss function with respect to the inputs. And so we go one step further and use something called the Jacobian vector trick to allow us to efficiently backpropagate, or to efficiently compute that gradient of the loss with respect to all parameters. So that was a lot of nitty gritty. And so for those who didn't completely follow this slide, don't worry about it. But the key takeaway is that we are basically able to, having solved our optimization problem, write down a set of equations that we can take derivatives through in order to get the gradients that we need. And this basically allows us to now embed this optimization problem as a layer within our broader deep learning workflow. So, some collaborators and I kind of concurrently introduced this framework back in 2017. And since then, there have actually been a lot of additional tools proposing new optimization layers within neural networks. So concurrently, one of my collaborators proposed work in differentiable quadratic optimization. And then since then, there's also been work expanding the sets of convex optimization problems we can do this with, bringing in combinatorial optimization problems, bringing in power system optimization problems, and so forth. And so what we have today is really a powerful toolkit for optimization in the loop machine learning. We can actually now embed a lot of different kinds of optimization problems into our deep learning workflows. And the question is, now that we have this, what can we actually do with it? So next, I want to kind of move on to this first setting that I talked about earlier of creating reinforcement learning methods with hard control constraints by leveraging this ability to embed optimization problems into deep neural networks. But again, before I move on, are there any questions that anybody has?
Are you able to broadly characterize the types of optimization problems this works on and the types it doesn't?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the exact, this particular methodology that I talked about, you want your so for this to be completely airtight from the perspective of an optimization theorist, you need your optimization problem to be convex. For this specific methodology on the slide, you then end up needing your this equation here, where you're applying the implicit function theorem, to end up being a linear equation that you can actually solve. And then this method works kind of out of the box for anything that applies to. That said, I talked about on the next slide, people have done a lot more. They've done a kind of broader set of convex problems for which the KKT conditions don't look as nice. They've done combinatorial optimization. And in practice, what they've done is they've used a different set of equations that are not the KKT optimality conditions that they can write down instead, that have the same property, that they're satisfied at the solution of the optimization problem. And then we can differentiate through them. But for those particular optimization problems, the KKT conditions don't look as nice. So broadly today, I'd say for any convex optimization problem, there is some way, even if it's not the fastest, to be able to compute the derivatives through the problem. And additionally, there have been a lot of ways in which people have rewritten or reparameterized or massaged non-convex optimization problems in ways that they look approximately convex at their solution. And as a result, you can sort of apply this methodology as well in a way that would make somebody who really wants the optimization theory to be tight a little bit nervous, but where somebody who's coming from the deep learning side and says, I don't need all of my gradients to be perfect. I need most of them to be good, because in the process of stochastic gradient descent, some of these will end up not mattering anyway. It works well enough from that perspective. So airtight for convex optimization problems, and a bit of fudging that you can do if you want to incorporate kind of a broader set of optimization problems as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Would you be able to give an example of a small optimization problem that this could be like, just to make it a bit more concrete?
Yeah, so let me go onwards to the next part of the talk, because the different components will have a couple of optimization problems in there, but feel free to re-ask this question if you want me to dive into it when I get to it. Does that sound good?
Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. Cool. All right, so diving into this first setting of enforcing hard control constraints. So before I gave this motivation that we need well-performing control methods on the power grid, but ones that also guarantee the enforcement of hard constraints. So the approach that my work takes is, using reinforcement learning, but using this framework of optimization in the loop learning to actually guarantee enforcement of hard constraints. So during this part of the talk, I'll primarily talk about one particular setting and one particular constraint we're trying to satisfy, called asymptotic stability in power grids. But the same framework applies to other settings. And so I'll briefly talk about a building control setting as well. So when it comes to the problem of controlling a system, there are two different communities that are working on this problem and are philosophically coming at it from relatively different directions. So the first of these is the reinforcement learning community, and recently the deep reinforcement learning community, which basically says, if we have some simulator of our system or some way to try things out on our system, let's put a machine learning model on the system and let it try things and get some signal on how well the actions that it proposed actually performed. The pro here is that doing this actually allows you to get really expressive, well-performing policies, particularly in the realm of deep reinforcement learning, where you have a neural network characterizing your policy of your way of choosing actions. And that neural network is potentially very nonlinear, can potentially be very expressive and so forth. We've seen that in areas like online games like Dota, that these methods are able to really learn to do very complex things. The con is that deep reinforcement learning methods and reinforcement learning methods in general are subject to failures and potentially catastrophic ones. They tend to have, almost no guarantees on their performance. And there is a kind of area called safe reinforcement learning that does try to deal with this, but basically by making some smoothness assumptions on the dynamics or things like this, and even then you don't tend to get provable guarantees, you get some kind of a heuristic notion that your method will stabilize your system. So generally speaking, reinforcement learning, very high performing, but no kind of provable guarantees with respect to the performance. And this isn't necessarily acceptable for systems like power grids, where a failure means you're blacking out your entire system. On the other hand, you have the control theory community. So for example, the robust control community, and they approach this differently. So rather than performance being the thing that they primarily optimize for, they basically say our controllers must provably satisfy the stability guarantees that we need in our underlying system. And so what they tend to do is they tend to write down some characterization of the uncertainty in their underlying system, make some kind of simplifying assumption on their controller, for example, that it's linear. And this allows them to write down a set of equations that they can actually solve, and that pops out their linear controller, as well as a certificate that is showing that the controller will provably stabilize the system. So the pro here is that you're able to synthesize controllers that do have provable stability guarantees, which is great from the perspective of, for example, a power system. The con here, though, is in order to do that, the control theorists tend to make simplifying assumptions on their controllers, for example, that they're linear. And when you're often controlling nonlinear systems, this is a mismatch. You have a linear controller on a nonlinear system, and you're potentially leaving a lot of performance on the table. So the question is, can we somehow merge these two perspectives? Can we somehow improve performance in the same way as you would in reinforcement learning, but while still guaranteeing stability in the same way that you would in robust control? So what we do is we basically say, okay, let's start with a neural network. This neural network is going to take in some information about the state of the system, and it's going to propose some action based on what it sees. That said, that's not the action we're actually going to take. What we're going to do is we're going to project that action onto a set of actions that we have pre-computed are safe. And I haven't yet told you how we get this set of actions, and I will, but for now, assume we have some set of actions that we know are going to be safe. We basically just project the output of the neural network onto that set of actions, and the resultant action is what we take. And this is our model. It is a neural network plus a projection. Now, since I told you kind of previously that this projection, this projection is an optimization problem. And since I've told you previously that we can now differentiate through optimization problems, we can actually treat this whole model in kind of exactly the same way we would treat any kind of neural network within a deep reinforcement learning workflow. So we get some kind of reward or some kind of notion of how good our action was. We back propagate throughout this entire workflow. And the result is a deep learning based policy that nonetheless has provable robustness guarantees. So a thing I've really glossed over here, of course, is, what does this projection look like? What is the set of actions that we're projecting onto? And so I want to briefly talk about that. Oh, was there a question or no? Okay. So yeah, so the basic insight here is that using insights from control theory, we derive a set of actions that are guaranteed to satisfy relevant, what are called Lyapunov stability criteria, but relevant stability criteria on our system, even under worst case conditions. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but I'm happy to kind of dive in more depth for those who are interested. But basically, from the control theory literature, we get some kind of uncertainty model of our underlying dynamics. So basically, this model says that the way that the state of the system evolves over time is characterized by, in this case, some kind of linear function of our state, plus a linear function of our action, plus a linear function of some uncontrollable disturbance, where this disturbance can actually be arbitrary, it's unknown. This disturbance can be like an arbitrary nonlinear function of the state and the action, so it can characterize something really complex. But where we know that the size of the disturbance is bounded by a particular function of the state and the action. So the dynamics here are unknown in the sense that the disturbance is unknown, and they can be really nonlinear in the sense that the disturbance can be nonlinear. But we've basically taken from robust control this one of these models of just how do you characterize the way that the uncertainty in this model actually looks. And so while this is one particular example of an uncertainty model, there are several others that you can use, many others that you can use. And if, for those who are curious, the paper that this is from, we actually explore a couple of these other ones as well. We actually then, from the kind of, by using traditional robust control techniques, we actually obtain a Lyapunov function, or for those who don't know about Lyapunov functions, basically you can think of it as a potential function for your system where high values characterize that you're farther from some equilibrium and low values characterize that you're closer. And then we take this criteria called an exponential stability criterion, also from the robust control literature, which basically says, if I have a controller that decreases my Lyapunov function by enough at every step, at every point in time, then basically I am provably like moving my system towards some kind of equilibrium. So this is all kind of taken directly from the control theory literature. The uncertainty model, we obtain a Lyapunov function using traditional control theoretic methods, and we take the stability criterion directly from control theory. And what we do is we say, okay, if I'm at a given state, can I find a set of actions that cause us to satisfy this exponential stability criterion, that cause us to decrease our Lyapunov function by enough, even in the worst case, even if our disturbance is as bad as possible. And so that's what this kind of mess of equations is on the bottom of the slide. We're basically solving for a set of actions U, such that this left side of the equation, which is what depends on our disturbance, even if that thing is as big as possible, it is still less than or equal to the right side of our exponential stability equation. And kind of writing all of that out, we end up getting this set, which is convex and ends up being non-empty. It's a convex set in our action space, and it ends up being non-empty. And so in this case, then our optimization problem within our neural network is a projection onto this convex set. So that's to address the previous question, this is one kind of optimization problem you could put in, which is like minimize the L2 distance between the input action and the output action, subject to the fact that the output action needs to lie in this set. And so that's the optimization problem that we have. And now our policy, again, is to basically take a neural network and project its output onto the set of actions. So I went through that fairly quickly. And if again, if you didn't get every detail on this slide, it's not a big deal. But the basic idea is that we take insight from robust control to write down this set of actions that we know are going to be safe. And then we're able to project onto that set of actions to make sure that the output of our overall workflow satisfies these stability criteria that we need to satisfy. So was there a question? Sorry.
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're restricting the set of control actions to be within the constraint set. And so I guess you're getting some expressiveness over linear control. What is that gain in expressiveness? I mean, because you're still now rejecting certain actions that you could have taken into reinforcement learning, right?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Let me maybe go on to the next slide, showing some illustrative results, which might start to get at that question, but then let me know if you want to dive in further than what I end up showing. Yeah. So to illustrate this, we test this out on like a synthetic NLDI, norm-bounded linear differential inclusion system. That's just the kind of system I showed on the previous slide. And here the y-axis is LQR cost. It's some notion of control cost where lower values are better, and this is on a log scale. And so the first three methods that are shown here are non-robust methods. The first is from control theory, and the second and third are two variants of kind of non-robust reinforcement learning methods. The fourth column here is a robust control method. And in the paper, we kind of show several other methods as well, but just for simplicity, I'm only showing one here. And then the last two columns here are variants of our method, which are kind of combining reinforcement learning and this differential projection layer. And we explore this both in an ordinary setting, where basically all of these models are trained on a system that is kind of proceeding as usual, nothing unusual is happening, and then also tested on a similar system. But then we also explore an adversarial setting where the algorithms are all trained on a system that's proceeding as usual. But when they're actually tested, we construct a disturbance, this uncertainty, to be as bad as possible for each individual method to see what happens when we do that. And so the things to kind of point out here is that when you compare our methods, which combine reinforcement learning and robust control, to kind of a linear robust control method, we're able to improve performance and somewhat significantly. Remember, this is on a log scale compared to the robust control method. To Keshev's question, though, right? If you look at these, standard reinforcement learning methods, I guess this one doesn't illustrate it as well, but basically, if you look at these standard reinforcement learning methods across these different experiments, you tend to see that in the ordinary case, these standard reinforcement learning methods are able to do much better, which is to say there is some loss of expressiveness that is coming from restricting the output of our reinforcement learning controller in the robust control setting, that the standard reinforcement learning methods, they don't lose that expressiveness and they're able to do much better. But the trade-off is that when you look at this adversarial setting, which is a proxy for what kinds of worst case things could happen on your system, all of the robust methods, including ours, stay stable, whereas all of the non-robust methods go unstable. They basically, this is like the cutoffs are meant to indicate just like numerical overflow on the system, actually. They really blow up the system. And so this is the trade-off, basically. This combination of reinforcement learning and robust control methods, they're basically able to improve performance over a standard robust control method while still maintaining stability, unlike kind of a fully unconstrained reinforcement learning workflow. Now, none of this comes for free, and the downside in this case is speed and computational cost. So a traditional robust control method, you are often solving one semi-definite program once. It's very fast to do this. The traditional the kind of non-constrained reinforcement learning methods, it's very fast to run the neural network behind them. Here, we're embedding an optimization problem and solving that at every pass through the reinforcement learning framework. And so while this is faster than certain fancy robust control methods and more stable than certain fancy robust control methods, when you compare against the sort of baseline, very simple control methods and the baseline reinforcement learning methods, it is more computationally intensive to actually compute these particular policies. So that's the trade-off. Keshav, did that sort of answer your question, or did you want to dive into it further?
No, this is good. Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
I have maybe one more follow-up question there. In terms of speed, does it also impact the sort of sample efficiency in the environment? So like how often you need to, how many steps you have to take in the environment to convert?
That's a great question. So we didn't evaluate that in this case. We evaluated in one of the other papers that I'll briefly talk about later on. But in general, you tend to be more sample efficient when you're embedding this kind of information into your model, and basically it's just because you've baked in more. Yeah, you've baked in more priors. You're not really fully depending on the data to get you there, and so you actually tend to be a little more sample efficient, actually. Yeah. Cool. So really briefly, just to underscore, I talked about in this setting, one particular kind of constraint, asymptotic stability. But this general framework of using a neural network and projecting its output onto a set of feasible actions extends more broadly than just that. So we employed a very similar setup for energy efficient heating and cooling in buildings, where we're basically trying to control the input to a heating and cooling system in order to minimize energy use, while respecting, in this case, our constraints were constraints on the underlying equipment, and also thermal comfort constraints. Our temperature could not drift too far outside a particular range while the building was occupied. And the basic framework ended up being pretty much exactly the same, where you have a neural network followed by a projection onto a set of feasible actions, and where the basic difference in details is that you have to use a different set of domain knowledge and assumptions in order to actually create this set of feasible actions that you're actually projecting onto. And what we saw really briefly in this realistic scale building simulation environment is that using this kind of method was able to improve energy efficiency relatively significantly compared to other methods, while maintaining this thermal comfort constraint in particular that we needed to satisfy. And these kinds of methods can potentially be significant. Depending on how you slice and dice it, residential and commercial buildings are almost 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and heating and cooling is half of that. So there's actually been a huge explosion of work recently in the kind of reinforcement learning for building control space, because it's one that's potentially very impactful and also actually ends up saving money because it actually is then using less energy for the building operator. So the basic summary of this part of the talk is that we needed to construct well-performing control methods that still guaranteed enforcement of various hard constraints. And the basic insight is that you can project the outputs of a neural network onto a set of safe actions that you obtain using domain knowledge. And then you can train this whole thing end to end so that the neural network is cognizant of how these outputs are actually being modified. And there are lots of future directions here, which include, additional paradigms for bridging reinforcement learning and robust control. This is just one example that I gave here of how you can do this, but there are lots of other ways that you can think of merging insights from these two fields. And then, as I mentioned earlier, improving the computational costs of this kind of method. So before I move on, I'll kind of really quickly go through this last example. But before I do that, are there any kind of remaining questions on this last part? Okay, so I'll dive right into this last setting then. So earlier on, I talked about the setting of electricity demand prediction in power grids. And the idea is that when you make an electricity demand prediction, it doesn't sit in a vacuum. It's used to make some kind of decision, like your demand prediction informs how we're actually going to schedule electricity supply. And some mistakes from the perspective of the demand prediction are worse than others. For example, if I overpredict demand or I underpredict demand, from the perspective of a usual model that just says how accurate is my prediction, an overprediction and an underprediction look pretty much the same. But from a decision maker's perspective, an overprediction of demand means you overschedule electricity supply, and an underprediction of demand means you underschedule electricity supply. And these have very different implications in terms of the costs and consequences for the underlying system. And underscheduling is way worse than overscheduling. So how do we actually create forecasting models that are cognizant of these the implications of the different mistakes they can make, and are able to avoid making mistakes that are particularly bad? And the approach we take is by using this framework of optimization in the loop machine learning. So I'm going to dive just, I think, into the decision cognizant electricity demand forecasting method, but Some of my other work has looked at kind of similar frameworks for this as well. So the setup we're looking at is one in which we have some information about past, features. So past electricity demand, weather, time of day, and so forth. And we're trying to make predictions of electricity demand over the next 24 hours. And in this setting, we're actually looking at probabilistic forecasts, but I'm actually going to gloss over that in a lot of my notation here. And the usual goal in a neural network workflow is to then try to create predictions that are as accurate as possible. So you're trying to minimize the distance between your predicted demand, h sub theta of x, and your true demand, y, where L is some, distance metric, or it could be something like root mean squared error, so forth. But as I've argued, we don't necessarily want to just think about the accuracy of the forecast. We want to think about what is the implication of this forecast for the decision that is being made downstream. Understanding that a perfect forecast would lead us to make a perfect decision, but since we're basically never making perfect forecast, basically the kinds of mistakes we make can affect how good the downstream decision is. And so instead, that leads us to maybe say, instead of optimizing directly for accuracy, let's optimize for the quality of the decision, of the power generation schedule that is made based on our forecast. So when we make some kind of forecast, the system operator is going to make some kind of power schedule, it's going to make some kind of decision. The decision is going to act upon the actual electricity demand, and we want to understand how good that decision ended up being. And so that leads to this different optimization problem that we're actually going to get a different loss function, that we're going to get our neural network to optimize for, where z star x theta indicates the best decision based on our forecast. So given that our neural network has inputs x and current parameters theta, then outputs some forecast y hat, what is the best decision that could be made on the basis of that forecast, that's z star. And then we evaluate the cost of that decision based on the true electricity demand we see downstream. And this is now the loss function that we're actually optimizing for. So to put that pictorially, in case it just sort of helps envision it in a different way, we have our forecasting model, which is a neural network, which is taking in historical data and outputting predictive demand. We then put that predicted demand into a power system optimization model, which then spits out what the electricity generation schedule in theory should be, assuming that that forecast is correct. And then we evaluate the cost of that decision, of that power generation schedule, when it actually acts upon the true system, where we observe the true demand. And since this power system optimization problem is differentiable, we're able to treat this loss function like we would any other loss function and just backpropagate throughout this entire workflow. So the reason we do this is that taking this kind of decision cognizant forecasting approach can dramatically improve outcomes from the perspective of the downstream decision maker. So to show this, I want to show two different plots. In this first plot, what you're seeing is the red dashed line is a traditional forecasting model that's using a neural network and is just optimizing for accuracy as you usually would. And the green solid line is our decision cognizant model, which is adding in this knowledge of the power system optimization process into the loss function. Since we're making predictions over 24 hours, the x-axis is the hour of day for which we're evaluating error, and the y-axis is the root mean squared error, so lower values are better here. And what we see, maybe unsurprisingly, is that when we compare our model and the accuracy optimizing model on the basis of accuracy, our model is actually slightly worse. So our model is making slightly worse predictions from a quote unquote objective perspective. But when you look at the implications of those predictions for the cost of the downstream decision, the picture really flips. And what we end up seeing is that using this decision cognizant approach and allowing our model to make mistakes that would be viewed as worse from an accuracy perspective allows it to actually make trade-offs in what kinds of mistakes it's making that are much better from the perspective of the decision maker. For example, avoid making under predictions at a moment when that might be particularly bad for the scheduling of power. So that's the basic idea. Basically, by being cognizant of the downstream decision and baking that into your training process, you can avoid making mistakes that are particularly bad from that perspective. And I won't go into it in detail, but we use a pretty similar kind of idea to do things like approximate power system optimization problems like AC optimal power flow that are cognizant of the downstream physics that the outputs of those problems are going to face. And we also end up doing similar things in the context of another optimization problem in power grids called N-K security constrained optimal power flow, where basically, again, the outputs of our machine learning model are cognizant of the downstream physics that that model is going to interact with. So I flashed those two on the slide just to say if anybody's interested in chatting about those further, we definitely can. But the basic summary of this part of the talk is that when we're creating models that are predictive models that are operating within some larger process, there's some downstream decision-making process that's going to use the forecast that you're creating, or some downstream physical process that the outputs of your model will interact with. We can use optimization in the loop machine learning to actually embed knowledge of that downstream decision-making process or physics into the loss function of our workflow using differentiable optimization. And this can kind of improve outcomes of the overall end-to-end process. So there are a lot of future directions here. I mean, in my work, we've really looked at a very small range of decision-making paradigms or kinds of decisions that you can embed in this way. But I think there's much more scope to really think about what is the broader set of decision-making procedures that our models interact with, and how can we imbue our models with some knowledge of those decision-making procedures. And I mean, while I've discussed this framework of creating this kind of decision cognizant or task-based model as being really good for this particular application, it can mean that if you try to use that same predictive model for a different decision-making process, we don't know if that model is going to be much better than or much worse than if we had just used a traditional accuracy optimizing model. So I think really better understanding the trade-offs between task agnostic versus task-based models, or when you can kind of lift a model that was used in one setting and put it into another setting, could, I think, be a really interesting future direction. So to summarize overall, today we talked about this framework of optimization in the loop machine learning, which is a way to embed knowledge of physics, hard constraints, decision-making processes into machine learning workflows. And we talked about two different example settings where this can happen, one of which is enforcing hard control constraints in reinforcement learning workflows, as well as incorporating knowledge of downstream decision-making processes into predictive models. So for those who are interested in chatting about this further, I would love to do that. So feel free to reach out. And then also for those who are more broadly interested in this intersection of machine learning and kind of electric power systems or climate change, I would also encourage you to check out the Climate Change AI community, which basically, Climate Change AI it's a nonprofit that I co-founded during my PhD, which basically tries to catalyze impactful work at this intersection of climate change and machine learning by bringing people together, providing educational resources, providing funding, and so forth. And so there are various digital resources available online, workshops at the main machine learning conferences that you can submit your work to, summer schools, research funding programs, an online community, and many more things. So I'd encourage you to check out the Climate Change AI website, or just email me if you're interested to kind of take advantage of some of these resources. So with that, I think we have a couple more minutes. So welcome any questions, and thanks so much for listening.
Please feel free to speak up if you have any questions.
I have a question about the constraints. So you spoke about some mathematical framework that allows you to know that they're differentiable, but how do you kind of make sure from the outside view, is it just a lot of testing? How do you make sure that it doesn't hinder the training of the whole problem, of the problem as a whole, right? So some constraints might completely if you enforce them too hard, they might completely stop the training? Or how do you know the problem is possible and you just need to tune it? And how do you know, how do you think, how would you approach kind of, does the constraint completely break it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think in this like reinforcement learning framework, what you basically want to make sure never happens is that this set of constraints that you're projecting onto becomes empty. If the set of constraints becomes, always there's only one action that you can take, then this whole framework is overblown and you probably shouldn't be using it. So in the best case, you really have at least a couple of actions to select between at any given moment within the set that you're projecting onto. And in terms of how to determine that, it really does sort of depend on domain knowledge. So for example, for the control theory work, because of the way that we construct this set, we actually know that it's always going to be non-empty. So we know that there will be at least one action that is contained in this set. So training won't completely stop. And basically it's because this Lyapunov stability criterion also like enforces that you're never leaving some sort of set of actions where you will have a next safe action to take. But in general, yeah, you would need to use some, certain kinds of domain knowledge to understand basically what you need to do to make sure that the set stays non-empty.
Any other questions? Maybe one more, which is, firstly, thanks for the very interesting talk. That's very cool. I have one more question, kind of going back to this reinforcement learning setup here. Is this kind of, are the gradients that are produced by this projection layer? So if you kind of at the boundary condition, are they always kind of good for learning in the sense that they lead to the feasible region in a sort of reasonable time, or is this something you need to think about very carefully as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. You, in some cases, do need to think about this a little bit carefully. So actually in this, in the control theoretic work, it actually didn't end up mattering too much because the set you're projecting onto at each set of time actually changes. So it's not so much that you're like, it's fine that you're kind of always projecting onto the boundary of that particular set because the set is changing over time and it just ends up being okay. In this building energy efficiency setting though, we were trying to control a heating and cooling system to satisfy certain constraints, and those constraints sort of stayed the same over time. And what you would find is if your loss function didn't, basically if you just let your model kind of train in the way you'd expect, your model would always be hitting the boundary of your constraint set, and it would just never be able to get any better than that. There was never any incentive for the model to do better than that. And so in this case, we actually added a term in the loss function to incentivize that the pre-projection and post-projection actions were as close as possible. And this basically enabled our model to actually not just get stuck at the boundary of these things, but actually do something, actually improve performance beyond that. So yeah, basically in some cases, you'll want to think through like, what is the loss function that enables you to not just always be hitting solutions at the boundary of your constraint set.
Okay. That's very interesting. Yeah. Thanks a lot for that.
For sure. And yeah, if you're interested in that, in this paper, we actually do a little bit of like an exploration of like, what does the solution look like if you do and don't do this kind of loss function engineering? So there's like a bit more of exploration into why we need to do this.
Yeah, great. I'm looking for it.
Yeah.
Can I ask the last question then, which is in your comparison, you talk about LQR, which is sort of a classical control approach, and then robust LQR, but what about model predictive control? Because that also allows you to satisfy constraints, hard constraints, and also allows you to do optimization in sort of a non-classical way. How would you compare your work with MDC? Yeah,
so we actually, in the paper, we compare against kind of a robust model predictive control method. And what we end up finding is that in some cases, the robust model predictive control method ends up outperforming us. But in other cases, for numerical reasons, it ends up going unstable because the semi-definite program that it's solving is just not guaranteed to actually be like well conditioned over time. And that it's just much more computationally expensive. For us, we're solving a cheaper quadratic projection or something like that at every moment. And these methods that are more dynamic model predictive control and trying to create robustness, they're solving a semi-definite program at every moment in time. And so the computational costs end up being actually pretty high for those methods. So yeah, so sometimes better, but I think some trade-offs as well.
Great, thank you very much. We are at time, so let's thank you again.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody.
Great, so fantastic. We can now end the seminar. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be people in there. So it's awesome.
Awesome. All right, have a good rest of the day, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.